It was supposed to be a simple flight. David Sinclair, a black billionaire and CEO of one of the most influential firms in the country, boarded first class as he had done countless times. A flight attendant, mistaking calm for weakness, insisted he was in the wrong seat. David politely showed his reservation, but she wasn't interested in proof-only power. Moments later, David found himself quietly relocated to economy. His presence dismissed without another though. But David wasn't just any passenger. 10 minutes after the plane took off, calls were made. A ripple effect began, subtle at first, but undeniable. The flight crew grew tense. Whispers passed through the cabin. And by the time drinks were served, the first-class section wasn't smiling anymore. By the time the plane landed, the flight attendant had no idea her career was already hanging by a thread. Stay with me. What happened next will make you think twice about who you're dealing with at 30,000 feet. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from and let me know, do you think the flight attendant got what she deserved? If this story grabs you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful moments like this one. David Sinclair entered the plane the way he entered most rooms, quietly, but with a presence that seemed to ripple beneath the surface. He wasn't the loudest or the flashiest man in the cabin, but there was something about him that spoke of experience, as if he carried the weight of stories untold, heavy as iron but polished smooth with time. It was an ordinary Thursday, the kind of day that made no promises, and David liked it that way. He traveled not for spectacle but for the stillness it gave him. The way the clouds, thick and sprawling, seemed to soften the sharp edges of the world below. His seat, 12A, had been booked weeks ago. First class, window view. It wasn't about luxury, it was about habit. He liked to sit by the glass, to trace the arc of the sky with his eyes and feel. For a moment, untethered from everything else, as David walked down the aisle, he noticed the subtle shift in atmosphere. It wasn't the loud kind of shift, the shouts or murmurs of a real confrontation. It was quiet, the way the body tenses when something just feels off. Up ahead, a white woman in a pressed uniform, mid-30s. Hair pulled tight, stood firm. Her lips tight with the kind of forced politeness that wasn't meant to be kind at all. She was speaking to another passenger, but David could tell from the stiffness of her shoulders that it wasn't a conversation. It was a lecture. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the back. This seat is already taken." Her voice cut through the low hum of boarding passengers. The man she spoke to, younger and black, hesitated, one hand gripping the handle of his carry-on. His eyes darted to the seat, empty and pristine, but he said nothing. The silence was loud enough. David paused, just for a second, but then, as he had done 1,000 times before, he lowered his gaze and kept walking. "You pick your battles." Sliding into his seat, David placed his bag in the overhead bin and sank into the leather. The plane continued to fill. The sounds of zippers, overhead bins slamming shut, and soft conversation swirling around him. It wasn't until 10 minutes later that she appeared at his row. "Excuse me, sir." Her smile was tight, professional, and yet David could feel the edge behind it. She didn't look him in the eye. Not really. The clipboard she held might as well have been a shield. "It seems we have a mix-up with the reservations. I'm going to have to ask you to switch to another seat." David raised his brow, pulling his phone from his pocket. The confirmation was right there, black and white, clear as daylight. He had learned long ago to keep receipts for things that people like him were often asked to prove. "There's been no mix-up," he said, voice steady. 12A, reserved under David Sinclair. For a moment, the clipboard lowered slightly. She leaned in just enough to glance at the screen. Then the hesitation. It was small, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. But David knew that look. He had seen it behind bank counters, in hotel lobbies, and now, 30,000 feet above the ground. She knew he was right. "And yet, I'm sorry, but I need you to move. There's another passenger who—" "No." David cut her off gently, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "I won't be moving." Her eyes tightened, just enough to let him know that this wasn't over. There was no apology as she turned on her heel, clipboard tucked close to her chest. David watched her retreat down the aisle, leaning slightly to catch a glimpse of the front cabin, where she disappeared through the curtain. The hum of the engines felt louder now. It wasn't about the seat. It never was. The thing about moments like this is that they leave a taste behind, bitter and metallic. Like you bit down on a nail by mistake. And no matter how much you tell yourself to let it go, it lingers, sticking to the roof of your mouth. David glanced out the window, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. Older now, softer around the eyes. The gray in his hair felt heavier today. A few minutes passed before the curtain parted again. This time, a man followed her. Older, white, hair thinning but slicked back as if trying to hold on to some vestige of control. The supervisor. He crouched slightly by David's seat. The way people crouch when they want to seem sympathetic but not enough to let go of authority. Mr. Sinclair, I apologize for the inconvenience, but we're going to need you to vacate this seat. I'm sure you understand. David's gaze met his directly. Level and unwavering. No, David said again, softer this time, but just as immovable. I don't understand. For a beat, neither man spoke. Passengers shifted in their seats, trying not to stare but inevitably caught in the gravity of the moment. David could feel their eyes grazing his back. The kind of watching that didn't want to be seen. The supervisor's smile thinned. Sir, this isn't about. But David knew exactly what it was about. It's fine, David said, rising from his seat, slow and deliberate. He didn't make a scene. There was no outburst, just the quiet shuffle of his belongings as he moved toward the back of the plane. The eyes followed him all the way down. When he finally sat again, wedged between two strangers in the cramped economy section, he caught sight of her through the sliver between the seats. The flight attendant. She was smiling. And in that moment, something shifted. David Sinclair was not a man who picked fights. But this wasn't about the seat. No, this was far from over. David Sinclair sat in the cramped seat, knees grazing the edge of the tray table in front of him. His elbow brushed against the arm of the man beside him, a broad-shouldered figure who didn't seem inclined to shift or share space. The air was thick, heavier somehow, as if the small injustice of the day had settled in the cabin, filling the crevices between the passengers. The hum of the engines rose, a distant tremor vibrating through the floor beneath his shoes. David stared out the window. But the sky outside no longer felt like an escape. It reflected his own shadow back at him, a silhouette that, no matter how much he tried, seemed always to occupy the wrong seat. He thought of his father. The long car rides, the faint scent of tobacco smoke, and the stern lessons woven into quiet moments. A man's dignity isn't in the clothes he wears or the money he carries. It's in how he holds himself when they try to take those things away. David had spent his life holding himself together. Yet even now, after all he had built after decades spent climbing the ladder, investing, donating, sitting in boardrooms where his name alone shifted the temperature of the conversation, there were still days like this. Days when a clipboard, a tight smile, and a polite excuse were enough to shrink him back down to something small. Something less than. He glanced at his phone. His assistant's message still blinking on the screen. Need me to handle this? David's thumb hovered over the keyboard. Not yet. The flight attendant walked past him then, the click of her heels muted by the cabin carpet. Laura Delaney, that was the name stitched above the polished gold wings pinned to her chest. Her gaze swept over him for the briefest of moments. And David caught it, the flash of recognition. She knew exactly where he was sitting. She had put him there. And she was fine with it. David exhaled slowly, measured. It was subtle, the kind of thing that didn't warrant outrage. It wasn't about curses or slurs, no. This was more insidious. It was the quiet recalibration of value. The silent suggestion that he didn't quite belong where he had been sitting. It was the seat itself, emptied of him like a space that was never his to fill. The plane began to taxi. David let his eyes drift across the rows ahead of him, catching glimpses of the leather headrests in first class. The distance between those seats and the narrow ones back here, separated by more than just a curtain. Some barriers are invisible until you try to cross them. The plane lifted off, pressing David gently into the seat back. He closed his eyes, letting the weight of gravity pin him there, as if holding him still long enough to remind him of what he already knew. But the feeling didn't pass. It stayed with him through the first half hour of the flight. During the safety demonstration, the offering of drinks, the shuffle of passengers adjusting pillows and shifting trays. He watched Laura as she moved gracefully down the aisle, her interactions with others light, effortless, but every time her gaze slid across his, it hardened, tightening as if to remind him that he had been the disturbance. David recognized that look, too, The look of someone who thought she'd won. At 30,000 feet, David made a quiet decision. The phone slipped from his pocket without urgency. No grand gestures, no need for confrontation. He scrolled through his contacts, pausing on a familiar name: Mark Leland, CEO of Skyline Airways, a competitor to this airline. A friend. David tapped the call button, lowering his voice. "Mark, it's David." Mark's voice crackled through the speaker, warm and familiar. "David, didn't expect to hear from you mid-flight. What's up?" David's gaze flicked to the curtain separating first class. "I need a favor." There was a pause on the line. Mark was sharp enough to recognize the tone. "Say no more." And that was the end of it. David tucked the phone away, his expression unreadable. The wheels were already turning, and David Sinclair was nothing if not patient. A few minutes later, Laura Delaney reappeared, this time pushing a drinks cart. She stopped at his row, pouring a cup of water with the same precision she had served the first-class passengers. "Would you like anything else, Mr. Sinclair?" He looked at her, eyes steady, voice calm. "No, thank you. I'm quite comfortable here." The words hung between them, heavy and unshaken. For the first time since he had stepped onto the plane, David saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. She recognized that tone, though she didn't know yet why. But she would. And as the flight stretched onward, the turbulence wouldn't come from the sky. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, soft and unassuming, like a distant lullaby meant to keep the world's sharp edges at bay. David Sinclair sat motionless, his gaze fixed out the window. But his mind traced circles around the events that had unfolded. The weight of it sat on his chest, not crushing, not unbearable, but present. Laura Delaney's heels clicked lightly down the aisle behind him. David didn't need to turn his head to feel her presence lingering. Pausing just slightly when she passed his row, he imagined the small satisfaction curling at the edge of her mouth. The kind of smile you wore when you believed you had reminded someone of their place. It wasn't the first time David had met that smile. The turbulence, though, was beginning to rise, not in the cabin, not yet, but inside him. He had spent his life navigating this unspoken terrain, the places where politeness became a veil for something colder. Something that didn't need to speak to be understood. Sometimes it was a glance. Sometimes it was a delayed handshake or the way someone skimmed over his credentials in a meeting, quick to move past his voice as though it were incidental. And sometimes it was a seat that should have been his. David wasn't angry, not in the way people expect. He didn't fume or bristle. No, David had learned long ago that anger, the burning kind, was too easily dismissed, too quickly labeled. Instead, his anger was colder now, like steel pulled straight from ice. His father used to say that when the world shows you what it is, you don't shout at the storm. You wait, and then you move with precision. David's phone buzzed softly against his leg. A text from Mark Leland. "I'll handle it. Give it a little time." David's eyes flicked to the front of the cabin, where Laura was exchanging hushed words with the head flight attendant, a middle-aged man whose face wore the lines of long service but lacked the weariness of confrontation. David didn't need to hear the conversation to know his name had been mentioned. Good. The temperature in the cabin shifted, imperceptible to most, but David felt it. It was in the way the attendants moved, slightly stiffer, a little more deliberate. The supervisor made a call, leaning into the galley phone near the front. Minutes passed, but David wasn't watching the clock. He simply sat. And then, slowly, things began to slip out of alignment. The first-class drink service, seamless just moments before, now stuttered. Orders were confused. A passenger in 3B gestured impatiently for his champagne, but the flight attendant offered the wrong glass. David heard the frustrated murmur travel through the rows like an undercurrent. A soft but persistent chime echoed from the cabin's control panel, an alert for a minor systems issue. David didn't move. Laura glanced back, this time with something thinner stretched across her features. The kind of smile that belonged to someone who could feel the cracks forming underfoot but wasn't yet sure how deep they ran. David watched the clouds below, the landscape shrinking beneath the plane. Another text arrived. Audit team has been notified. Expect turbulence. He almost smiled. The plane dipped slightly, no more than a gentle adjustment in altitude, but enough to send a ripple through the passengers. Laura's attention snapped forward, her hands tightening around the service tray as she hurried to stabilize the drink cart. David's voice, calm and steady, rose just enough to be heard. "Something wrong, Ms. Delaney?" She turned toward him, the color in her cheeks now betraying the first hint of doubt. "Not at all, Mr. Sinclair," she said, her tone clipped. "A small delay, that's all." David met her eyes, holding her gaze a second longer than necessary. "I understand. Small things have a way of growing if you don't handle them properly." The meaning settled between them like fog, and David could see her wrestle with it, deciding whether to press forward or retreat. She chose to retreat. By the time the plane had leveled again, David knew the second call had been made, this time to corporate. Laura's supervisor passed his row twice in 5 minutes, his eyes flicking down at David as though trying to calculate the damage without understanding the game. David knew the script. The airline would apologize. Laura would offer some soft gesture, perhaps a free drink, or a quiet, "Thank you for your patience," on the way out. They'd hoped to smooth the surface without diving below it. But David wasn't interested in small gestures. This wasn't about a seat. It was about the way some people, regardless of their status or wealth, were still made to prove themselves. It was about how easily respect could be withheld, not through violence, but through the slow erosion of dignity. By the time the plane approached the descent, Laura's posture had shifted. She had stopped smiling. David hadn't needed to raise his voice. He hadn't needed to move at all. The real turbulence had only just begun. The plane's descent began with the faintest tremble, a subtle shift that most passengers wouldn't notice. But David Sinclair noticed everything. The way Laura Delaney's hands tightened just slightly as she adjusted the cabin temperature. The way the head flight attendant leaned into the galley, his eyes flicking toward David's row as if measuring the distance between them. Trouble, like turbulence, didn't come all at once. It built in layers, quiet at first, but unmistakable to those who had felt it before. David watched the first-class curtain ripple as it was pulled open. Laura emerged, her polished shoes whispering against the carpet. But the confidence she wore earlier had faded at the edges. She moved slower now, the way people do when they're trying to make themselves smaller. She stopped just shy of David's row, lingering for half a breath too long. "Mr. Sinclair," her voice came soft, quieter than before. "I just wanted to apologize for the mix-up earlier. It was a misunderstanding." David lifted his eyes, calm but unwavering. "No misunderstanding," he replied, his voice low but steady. "I know exactly what happened." The cabin, though filled with murmurs and soft conversation, felt quieter somehow, as if the air itself had settled between them. Laura shifted, her smile faltering for the briefest of moments. She wasn't prepared for him to meet her head-on. "It's just procedure," she added quickly, as if the words would patch the gap she felt widening beneath her feet. "Sometimes things get shuffled around. You know how it is." David did know how it was. He knew how certain faces could sit comfortably in 12A without question, while others like his invited second glances and quiet removals. And yet, David said nothing. He let the weight of the silence sit between them. Unflinching, Laura shifted, gripping the edge of her service tray as if grounding herself. "If there's anything I can get you." "There is." David's voice cut clean through her offer. Her shoulders tensed slightly, though she masked it well. "I want you to ask yourself," David said, leaning in just enough that his words could not be mistaken for anything but intentional. "If the man sitting in 12A right now would have been asked to move if he looked like me." Laura's mouth opened, but no words came. She blinked, as if she hadn't prepared for the mirror David had just held up. "Think carefully," David added, his tone soft but sharp as glass. "Because you'll be answering that question long after we land." Her throat bobbed, and for a moment, David thought he saw something flicker in her eyes, recognition, perhaps, or shame curling quietly at the edges. But Laura, like so many before her, tucked it away beneath professionalism. "I understand, sir," she said, almost mechanical now. David didn't respond. As she turned to leave, he watched her shoulders stiffen, her steps just a little less sure than they had been. The plane continued its slow descent, clouds peeling away to reveal the sprawling cityscape of Los Angeles below. Passengers busied themselves with their phones, gathering their bags, murmuring softly about connecting flights and hotel reservations. David remained still. He could feel it now, the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. It moved like a current, invisible but undeniable. Flight attendants whispered behind the galley curtain. The supervisor passed by twice but said nothing, though David caught the way his gaze lingered as if searching for the right words and finding none. They were uncomfortable now, and not because David had raised his voice. No, David didn't need to. Respect, when withheld, doesn't need shouting to be restored. It only needs to be revealed. His phone buzzed gently. Another message from Mark. They're paying attention now. Let me know if you want me to push harder. David typed a brief reply. Not yet. He wasn't done letting them feel the weight of it. By the time the plane touched down, the tension had stretched thin across the cabin. Fragile as glass, passengers shuffled into the aisles, pulling luggage from the overhead bins, eager to disembark and move on with their lives. But David Sinclair's life was not the kind that allowed such things to be left behind. Laura stood by the exit door, her posture stiff but professional. As David approached, she smiled, though not the way she had smiled at the beginning of the flight. This smile was smaller, tighter at the corners. Thank you for flying with us, Mr. Sinclair, she offered, the words carefully chosen, measured. David paused, holding her gaze for just a moment longer than polite convention required. I hope you remember this flight, Ms. Delaney. His voice carried no malice, only certainty. Because I will, she swallowed, nodding lightly, but David saw the weight of the words settle on her shoulders. And then he stepped onto the jet bridge, the cool terminal air brushing against his face, and walked away. But the ripples, David knew, were only just beginning. The Los Angeles terminal was alive with movement, the shuffle of shoes against polished floors, the hum of voices merging into a distant, indistinguishable current. David Sinclair walked with the unhurried pace of a man who had nothing to prove, but much on his mind. As he moved past the crowds, he could feel the lingering touch of that flight, like the aftertaste of something bitter that refuses to fade. He hadn't looked back when he stepped off the plane, but he didn't need to. Laura Delaney's expression, tight and shaken, was etched into his memory as clearly as the seat number on his reservation. The world outside the glass walls of the terminal stretched endlessly, but David knew that even beneath the wide California sky, certain ceilings still followed him. You carry it with you, his father once said, even when you leave the room, even when they smile at you. It lingers. You'll know it by the way they watch you leave. David's father was right, but David had learned not to let that weight sit quietly. He pulled his phone from his pocket, stepping aside near a row of empty seats by the window. The sun was sinking low on the horizon, spilling orange light over the tarmac. His thumb hovered over Mark Leland's name again. The thought crossed his mind, let it go. But letting things go, he had found, was often just another way of letting them happen again. He made the call. David, Mark answered on the first ring, his tone light but curious. Wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon. Something tells me that flight didn't end as smoothly as it should have. You'd be right. David's voice carried the weight of someone recounting not a single event, but a familiar story that had been told too many times. Mark's sigh echoed softly through the receiver. Give me the short version. David's eyes traced the skyline beyond the window. They moved me, took my seat without reason. I let it happen, but I don't intend to let them forget it. There was silence on the other end for a beat, followed by the faint clicking of Mark's keyboard. Airline name? David smiled faintly. Mark knew how this worked. Sent it to you already, David replied. Mark chuckled. I figured. I'll make a few calls tonight. Let them squirm a little before I push it higher. Sometimes all it takes is a whisper from the right corner. David let the words hang between them for a moment. This isn't about revenge, Mark. I know. Mark's voice softened. But it's about reminding them. David nodded, more to himself than anyone else. By the time David stepped into the black car waiting outside the terminal, the city had begun to settle into its evening rhythm. The quiet hum of tires against asphalt filled the cabin as the car pulled onto the highway. His mind wandered not to the flight itself, but to the faces of the passengers around him, the ones who had watched as he moved toward the back of the plane. None of them had spoken. None of them had met his eyes for long. It wasn't malice. It was the kind of silence that people wear when they are relieved not to be the target. David had seen that silence in boardrooms, at country clubs, at fundraisers where the champagne flowed but the air was heavy with words unspoken. He thought of the man now sitting in 12A. He wondered if that man even knew the cost of the seat he had been given. The next morning, David sat by the window of his downtown hotel. sipping coffee as the phone on the table buzzed once more. It was Mark. They called me, Mark said without preamble. Corporate office. Asked if I knew anything about a situation involving a Mr. Sinclair. David raised a brow, setting his cup down. And what did you tell them? I told them I know exactly who you are. And I told them to ask themselves why they didn't know already. David leaned back, letting out a breath through his nose. I imagine that got their attention. It did, but it gets better, Mark added, his voice dipping slightly. They're launching an internal audit. Not just customer service, everything. From the crew to how they handle first-class reservations. They're scared. David, you shook something loose. David said nothing for a long moment. Good, because it was never about the seat. It was about how quietly people like Laura Delaney could rearrange the world beneath someone's feet. And how easily the world let it happen. Letting it go wasn't an option. Thank you, Mark, David said finally. I didn't do much. You were the one who sat in that seat. Mark replied. I'll keep you updated. David ended the call, the faint hum of the city filtering through the window. Later that afternoon, David passed through the hotel lobby, his mind far from the marble floors and sparkling chandeliers. As he stepped outside, his phone buzzed again, a message this time. Laura Delaney, suspended pending review. David stared at the screen for a moment, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet understanding that came with moments like these. She wasn't the first, and she wouldn't be the last. But perhaps next time, she would think twice before assuming she knew who was sitting in 12A. David slid the phone into his pocket and walked forward, the weight of the sky a little lighter on his shoulders. It had been 3 days since David Sinclair stepped off that flight. But the weight of it followed him like a shadow cast too long by the afternoon sun. He hadn't thought much about Laura Delaney since the message about her suspension arrived. Her face, her voice, those things had faded quickly. But the feeling? The feeling lingered, pressing against the edges of his thoughts like the faint hum of an engine long after the wheels hit the ground. David sat in the corner of a quiet cafe in downtown Los Angeles. Outside, the day was warm, but the heat didn't touch him through the tall windows. He watched the pedestrians moving along the sidewalks, ordinary people living ordinary lives. Unaware of the quiet battles fought in places like airports, restaurants, and boardrooms. It wasn't the grand acts of hatred that shaped most of the world. It was the small moments. The ones that passed so easily they were almost forgettable. Almost. His coffee sat untouched, cooling as he thumbed through the newspaper folded neatly on the table. The headline was Loud Politics. Markets. Scandals. But beneath it, buried somewhere between the lines, were the stories that mattered. He didn't need to read the words to know they were there. The quiet separations. The shifting glances, the ways people are made small in rooms that pretend to be open to everyone. David folded the paper, sighing softly as he leaned back in his chair. He was just about to rise when his phone vibrated against the wooden table. Mark Leland's name flashed across the screen. David answered. Mark, you're not going to believe this, Mark said, his voice carrying a strange mix of amusement and irritation. David rubbed his temple lightly. Try me. Mark hesitated for half a beat. Laura Delaney filed a complaint against the airline. David's brow arched slightly. For what? Wrongful suspension. Claims she was treated unfairly because of a misunderstanding involving a passenger of influence. Mark paused. That passenger being you. David's lips pressed together in a thin line. A slow breath escaped through his nose. Of course. He should have expected it. When people like Laura were forced to reckon with their missteps, it was never the action itself they blamed. It was the spotlight, the inconvenience of accountability. Mark continued. The airline's legal team is nervous. I imagine she's hoping for a quiet settlement. Wants them to cut her a check and move her quietly to another route. David let the weight of the words settle. There was no satisfaction in hearing it. He wasn't looking for anyone to be ruined, not Laura. Not the flight crew. This wasn't about vengeance. But there was a lesson here. One Laura Delaney hadn't yet learned. And the airline? David asked. They'll reach out. Soon. I think they want to put this behind them. But they're looking for you to sign off. An apology. Some goodwill. No. David said sharply, cutting him off. Mark paused. No? David leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the blurred reflections in the cafe window. They don't get to apologize for something they allowed to happen, David said, his voice low but firm. Not until they know what they're apologizing for. Mark exhaled slowly, as if weighing David's words in his head. You're not interested in settling this quietly, Mark said, though it wasn't a question. Quiet doesn't change anything, David replied. There was silence between them, stretched thin across the line. All right, Mark said at last. What do you want me to do? David tapped his fingers against the rim of his coffee cup, his eyes narrowing slightly. Let it play out, David said. Let her complaint make noise. Let them scramble. Mark chuckled softly. You're not going to make this easy for them. David's voice didn't rise, but there was steel beneath his words. Why should I? By the following afternoon, David's name had begun circulating quietly in the airline's upper offices. There were meetings he wasn't invited to. Conversations held behind closed doors where executives muttered words like optics and damage control. David wasn't in those rooms, but he felt the ripples. A carefully worded email arrived late that evening, from someone high enough to matter. Mr. Sinclair, we deeply regret the incident involving your recent flight and would like to extend our sincerest apologies. We understand that mistakes were made, and we are actively reviewing our training procedures to ensure this does not happen again. David skimmed the message, his expression unreadable. It wasn't the words that bothered him. It was the tone, the polished softness that didn't name the problem but sought to sweep it gently under the rug. He set the phone down without responding. There would be more messages. More offers to make this disappear quietly, wrapped in phrases like good faith and moving forward. David wasn't interested. The thing about weight, the kind the world pressed on men like him, was that carrying it alone never lightened the load. Sometimes, the only way to lift it was to hand a piece of it back to the people who placed it there in the first place. And David Sinclair had no intention of letting them forget how heavy it was. The apology came 2 days later, wrapped in the sterile language of corporate diplomacy. David read it the way one reads a contract they have no intention of signing slowly. Without attachment. We apologize for the inconvenience. We value all our passengers. This is not reflective of our values. David had seen this script before. Words carefully arranged like polished stones, meant to fill the space where real accountability should have stood. But David wasn't a man who mistook words for action. The cafe where he sat was quieter than usual. The early afternoon crowd thinned to a few scattered patrons. A waitress floated by, refilling cups with mechanical precision, her smile absent-minded. David's phone lay face up on the table, the email still open. His thumb hovered over the reply button, but he didn't press it. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back, letting the faint hum of the city drift in through the half-open window. The weight of the week pressed against his chest, not unlike the pressure of takeoff, the slow, steady climb before the break into open sky. A seat, that's all it had been. A seat, and yet it felt like far more. He thought about the man now occupying 12A, thought about how easily he had slipped into that space, unaware of the small fracture that made room for him. David wondered if the man ever questioned why. The thing about racism, the quiet kind, the kind that doesn't spit or shout, is that it never comes carrying its own name. It slides in quietly, wearing the uniform of policy. It speaks in the language of procedure. It moves people to the back of the plane with the softest of smiles. David didn't respond to the email. He let it sit, unanswered. By the third day, another message arrived, this time with a name he recognized. Lisa Howard, the airline's VP of Customer Relations. The subject line read, Mr. Sinclair, I'd like to speak with you directly. David's lips curled faintly. It wasn't often that men like him were invited to conversations like these, not after the flight had landed. Not after the wheels touched down and the moment was supposed to be forgotten. He dialed the number from the email. Lisa answered after 2 rings. Mr. Sinclair, I appreciate you calling. I was hoping we could discuss. David cut her off gently, his voice steady. Lisa, let me save you some time. I know what this call is about. She paused, and David could hear the faint rustle of papers on the other end, perhaps notes she had prepared. Points she thought she needed to defend. David continued, You'd like to offer me something. Maybe a flight credit. Maybe a formal letter signed by your CEO. You'll tell me how serious this is, how you're revisiting policies, and how Laura Delaney's suspension is part of a broader effort to ensure no other passenger experiences what I did. The line was quiet. Lisa inhaled softly. We take incidents like this very seriously. Mr. Sinclair. David smiled, but there was no joy in it. I believe you do, he said, but tell me, Lisa, how many other passengers, ones without my name, without my connections, have been moved from their seats because of a mix-up? Another pause. I can't speak to that directly, Lisa replied, her voice softer now, but I can assure you, our team is addressing it. David leaned forward, resting his elbow on the table. Lisa, let me ask you something. His voice lowered, not out of anger, but with the gravity of someone used to having his words carry weight. If I hadn't made the calls I did, if my name hadn't passed across your executive desks, would anyone have been addressing it at all? The silence on the other end was answer enough. David let it sit. You see, he continued, what happened on that flight wasn't unique. It didn't surprise me. It didn't shake me, because I've been here before. I was born into this seat. And the problem isn't the seat, Lisa. The problem is how easily people like me are expected to sit in it without complaint. I understand, Mr. Sinclair, Lisa said softly. I do. David's eyes softened, his voice no longer sharp but weary. No, Lisa, you don't. The conversation ended politely, as David expected it would. Lisa promised to follow up. She would have meetings, draft proposals for training programs, and maybe even give a speech at a company-wide conference about diversity and equity in the workplace. David had heard it all before. But that wasn't why he took the call. He hadn't spoken to change Lisa's mind. He had spoken to remind her that men like him weren't silent. That evening, David walked the quiet streets of Los Angeles, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows against the sidewalk. He thought of his father, how he used to sit on the porch at dusk, watching the world slow down. You fight the battles you can see, his father once told him. But the hardest ones are the ones that hide. David Sinclair didn't fight with his fists. He fought with his presence. And tonight, his presence would not be moved. David Sinclair wasn't expecting another call. He thought Lisa Howard's voice would be the last one he'd hear on the matter. Thought the carefully worded apology and polished corporate regret would drift quietly into the archives of unimportant things filed away under incidents too minor to make the evening news but too significant to ignore completely. But the world doesn't always let you leave things behind. His phone rang late, close to midnight. Not Mark this time. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. But David answered anyway. Mr. Sinclair. The voice was male, steady but strained. My name is Michael Delaney. I'm Laura's husband. David's fingers tightened around the phone. I hope I'm not disturbing you, Michael added quickly, the weight in his voice growing heavier by the second. David leaned forward in his chair, eyes narrowing as he tried to place this unexpected shift in the air. You're not, David replied slowly, though something inside him told him otherwise. A pause stretched between them, long enough for David to hear Michael's unsteady breath on the other end. I know this is unusual, Michael continued, clearing his throat. Laura, she didn't ask me to call you. I'm doing this on my own. David's eyes darkened. He didn't respond, allowing Michael the space to wrestle with his words. Look, I'm not here to defend her, Michael said quickly, his voice lower now. I know what happened on that flight. I know what she did. And I know why she did it. David's heart slowed, his grip on the phone loosening slightly. She hasn't told me much, Michael admitted. But I know her well enough to see it. I've seen that look before. David's gaze drifted to the window. The city stretched out beneath him, quiet and indifferent, its lights flickering in patterns that seemed as ancient as the stars themselves. She's scared, Michael said, his voice cracking for the first time. And I guess, so am I. David exhaled, his mind circling back to Laura's face. The way her smile tightened during that flight. How her eyes softened into something smaller when she realized he wouldn't let the moment pass unnoticed. Fear has a way of catching up with us, David said finally, his voice calm but edged with something harder. But it's not fear she needs to be worried about, Michael, it's the truth. Michael sighed, the sound ragged and tired. I know, he said, I'm asking you to consider something. Not for her, for our kids. This isn't going to just affect Laura. It's already bleeding into everything else. I see it happening, her job, our home. We've worked hard for what we have. And I'm asking, man to man, if there's any way you could ease up. David's jaw tightened, and the room around him felt heavier. How many times had that same plea echoed through history? How often had the weight of injustice been set against the quiet comfort of those who feared disruption more than wrongdoing? But this wasn't new to David. Men like Michael, well-intentioned but unaware, had always existed in the wings watching the play unfold but rarely stepping onto the stage until the curtains threatened to close. David sat back, closing his eyes for a long moment. "I understand what you're asking, Michael," David said, his tone measured but unrelenting. "But I need you to understand something too." He let the words settle, ensuring Michael was listening. "This isn't about Laura's job or your home," David continued, his voice rising just slightly. "This is about the fact that she thought she could take something from me. Not because I did anything wrong. Not because of some misunderstanding. But because she thought she could. And the world would let her." Michael said nothing. "She didn't take my seat, Michael. She took my dignity," David said firmly. "And I've spent my whole life fighting to hold on to that because men like me don't get to put it down. Not even for a moment." David's hands trembled slightly as he rested them against the table, though his voice never wavered. "I could let this go," David admitted softly, his tone cooling. "But if I do, I'd be telling her and everyone watching that it's all right. That it can happen again. And that's not a message I'm willing to send." Michael's breath slowed on the other end, but the weight between them remained. "I'm sorry, Michael," David said finally. "But Laura made this choice. And the price isn't mine to pay." A long silence stretched between them. "I understand," Michael said quietly. I had to try." David nodded, though the man couldn't see him. "I respect that," David replied. "But now it's time Laura respects the seat she tried to take." David placed the phone down gently, his fingers lingering against the smooth glass. The city outside pulsed softly beneath the midnight sky. But David knew that some storms don't break until morning. And when they did, he would be ready. The world outside David Sinclair's hotel window stirred long before the city woke. The quiet before dawn held a peculiar weight, a stillness that hinted at the storm beneath the surface. David sat at the small desk by the window, his eyes tracing the horizon, though his thoughts drifted elsewhere, back to that cramped seat on the plane. Back to the eyes that had followed him down the aisle. It wasn't Laura Delaney's face he remembered most. It was the silence, the way the other passengers shifted in their seats, looking away but listening closely, complicit in their stillness. That silence haunted him more than the confrontation itself, because David had lived his entire life under its shadow. His father used to say, "The silence will kill you," long before the words. David hadn't understood that as a boy, but he understood it now. By noon, the email came. Lisa Howard's name flashed across his phone again, but the tone this time was different. "Mr. Sinclair, I understand your reluctance, but this matter is growing beyond what we anticipated. Laura Delaney has hired counsel, and the airline is prepared to negotiate privately to avoid further escalation." David's eyes narrowed as he read the message, his grip tightening on the phone. Escalation. That was the word they used when they wanted to frame the problem as mutual, as if his refusal to quietly accept their apology was just as disruptive as Laura's actions. The air in the room grew thin. David took a long breath, but the weight pressing against his chest didn't lift. His hand hovered over the keyboard. He could have typed a response in moments, accepted the settlement, signed the agreement, walked away with his pride intact and a check in his pocket. But pride wasn't the point. David had fought too long and too hard to settle for survival. By the time David stepped onto the street, the afternoon sun burned low in the sky. He walked without urgency, letting the rhythm of the city steady his thoughts. Mark Leland's office wasn't far, just a few blocks down. Tucked inside a glass building that shimmered beneath the glare. Mark had asked to meet in person, said it was better that way. More discreet. David didn't mind. Letting the world see him move was part of the lesson. Mark greeted him with a firm handshake and a faint smirk. "I take it you saw the email." David nodded, settling into the chair across from Mark's desk. The office smelled of leather and faint traces of cigar smoke. "She's playing defense now," Mark continued, pouring them both a drink. "But it's not really about Laura anymore. The airline wants this gone." David swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the light catch against its surface. "Of course they do," David replied. "They know what this looks like. And they know who I can call if they don't handle it right." Mark chuckled softly. "You're not wrong. I already had 2 executives reach out this morning, asking if you'd reconsider." David's gaze lifted slowly. "I told them no," Mark added. "Figured you weren't ready to let this go." David's silence was confirmation enough. Mark leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. You know, David, not every battle needs to be fought to the end. Sometimes making them nervous is enough. David's jaw tightened. He set the glass down carefully, folding his hands over his lap. Mark, do you remember the first time you were told to leave a room? David asked, his voice low but steady. Mark blinked, caught off guard by the shift in tone. No, Mark admitted, I can't say that I do. David's eyes darkened, but his face betrayed no anger, only the cool certainty of a man who had lived long enough to collect stories he never asked for. I do, David said softly. I remember the room, the chair I sat in, the look on the manager's face when he told me I didn't belong there. I remember how small I felt when I left. Mark's smile faded, and I remember how many times after that I let it happen. David continued, his voice tightening like a coiled spring. Because I thought if I didn't make trouble, if I kept quiet, maybe next time, they'd let me stay. David leaned forward, his gaze locking with Mark's. But they never let me stay. Mark, not until I made them. The room held its breath. Mark nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. I get it, he said finally. So, what's the next move? David's eyes flickered toward the window, watching the city churn below. They'll call me again, David said, and when they do, I'm going to make sure this isn't just about a seat. Mark raised his glass to shaking the table. Then, David clinked his glass softly against Mark's but said nothing. He wasn't interested in shaking the table. He was interested in rebuilding it. By the time David left Mark's office, the weight in his chest had settled, not gone, but quieter. As he walked through the lobby, his phone buzzed again. Another email, this time with a new subject line. Mr. Sinclair. Request for formal discussion. David smiled faintly, tucking the phone back into his pocket. They were learning, but the lesson wasn't over yet. The boardroom smelled of cold coffee and stale decisions. The air conditioning hummed softly, but it did nothing to cool the tension that sat like thick fog between the men and women at the polished oak table. David Sinclair sat at the far end, hands folded, posture steady. He wasn't here as a guest. He wasn't here to listen politely and nod at half-meant apologies. He was here to watch them sweat. And sweat they did. Lisa Howard sat 2 seats to his right, her eyes flicking toward him every few moments, trying to gauge his mood like a nervous child watching for signs of a storm. Across the table sat Thomas Grady, the airline's legal counsel, his thin fingers tapping against the stack of papers he'd been shuffling for the last 5 minutes. David let them wait. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, Grady cleared his throat. Mr. Sinclair, I want to start by saying how deeply we regret the incident that occurred on your flight. I can assure you. David raised a hand, cutting him off gently but firmly. I don't need assurances, Mr. Grady, David said, his voice soft but unyielding. I need answers. Grady leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. The tension in the room shifted. David glanced around the table, letting his gaze rest on each person just long enough to make them uncomfortable. What happened on that flight wasn't an isolated event. David continued, his voice calm, but each word carried weight. It wasn't a mix-up or a misunderstanding. It was the kind of decision people like me have been navigating for decades. Lisa shifted in her seat. Grady straightened his tie. I was moved, David said, his voice dropping lower. Colder, not because my reservation was wrong, not because of policy, but because someone believed without saying it that I didn't belong in that seat. No one responded. David leaned forward, his fingers brushing against the edge of the table. I understand how these things happen, David said, his gaze locking with Grady's. I understand the quiet ways dignity gets stripped. One policy at a time. One apology at a time. Grady opened his mouth to speak, but David wasn't finished. What I don't understand, David continued, his voice rising just slightly, is how, in 2025, men like me are still asked to step aside while someone else takes our place. And when we speak up, when we refuse to let it pass, we're labeled as the problem. Lisa's eyes dropped to the table. David let the silence settle again, heavy as iron. Mr. Sinclair, Grady began carefully, measuring each word. We acknowledge that mistakes were made. Laura Delaney's suspension was our attempt to address that. We're conducting a full review of our policies. And we're committed to ensuring this doesn't happen again. David smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. You think this is about Laura Delaney? David asked, tilting his head slightly. She's not the problem. She's just the symptom. Lisa's head lifted slightly, her eyes meeting David's for the first time. The problem is the system that allows people like Laura to believe they can make those decisions without consequence. David said, and the real question is, what are you going to do about that? The room went still. Lisa shifted forward, her voice quieter than Grady's but steadier. We're willing to work with you, Mr. Sinclair. If you have recommendations, training initiatives, we're open to collaborating. David exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of frustration tugging at the corner of his mouth. This isn't about collaboration, Lisa, David said. This is about responsibility. Grady frowned. What exactly are you suggesting? David leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the table. I'm suggesting that this airline take a long, hard look at how many other passengers have been quietly removed, dismissed, or made to feel small, and not just the ones wealthy enough to call someone like Mark Leland. David said, his eyes narrowing. Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. Grady's fingers stilled. I'm suggesting audits, David continued, not just for Laura Delaney's flight but for the last 5 years. Every formal complaint, every mix-up, every instance where a passenger was asked to move. Grady's face tightened. You want an investigation? Grady asked, his tone sharpening. I want the truth, David replied. The room held its breath. Lisa nodded slowly, though her expression betrayed the storm behind her eyes. We'll discuss it, she said softly. No, David said, his voice cutting through the room. You'll do it. The air grew thick. David stood, buttoning his jacket with calm precision. I'm not interested in settlements, David said, his eyes sweeping the room one last time. I'm interested in making sure no one else has to fight for the seat they already paid for. With that, David turned, the quiet scrape of his chair echoing louder than any words spoken in that room. As he walked toward the door, Lisa's voice followed him, tentative but sincere. Mr. Sinclair. David paused, turning just slightly. Thank you for not letting this go. David's eyes softened, though his expression remained unreadable. I stopped letting things go a long time ago. And with that, David Sinclair left the boardroom knowing that some storms don't end when you land. Some storms reshape the ground beneath you. The evening sky stretched wide over Los Angeles, dipping into that bruised shade of blue that appears just before the darkness settles in for the night. David Sinclair sat alone on the hotel balcony, the city humming softly beneath him. The boardroom was behind him now, but the weight of it lingered thick, pressing against his chest like the memory of an old wound that never quite healed. David had walked out, left them sitting there with their carefully rehearsed apologies and guarded promises. He could almost hear the faint rustle of papers as they resumed their meeting after his departure. Reshuffling policies like furniture, hoping it would make the room feel different. It wouldn't. David knew better. The truth about change, the kind that mattered, was that it didn't come quietly. It didn't slide in with polite conversation or settle beneath layers of corporate polish. It arrived like thunder, loud, undeniable, unsettling to those who had grown comfortable in their silence. And tonight, David was the storm. His phone buzzed against the small table, the screen glowing faintly in the dark. Mark's name. David answered without hesitation. Well, Mark's voice came with a dry chuckle. I heard you left them in worse shape than you found them. David smirked, leaning back in his chair. That was the point. They're not used to someone like you. Mark replied. They think men like us should be grateful for whatever seat they hand us, first class or otherwise. David's smile faded slightly. His eyes drifted to the horizon, where the last traces of sunlight clung stubbornly to the tips of the buildings. They think we're temporary, David said softly. They think dignity is something we barter for. Mark was silent for a moment. They're scared, Mark finally said. Lisa's already called twice. Grady's pushing back on the audit. Says it could open doors they'd rather keep closed. David's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest. Good, David replied. Let them sweat. Mark exhaled sharply through the phone. You know, David, there's an easier way to handle this. You've already made your point. They're willing to bend. Maybe we let this one simmer down. David closed his eyes, letting Mark's words hang there. How many times, Mark? David asked quietly. How many times do we let them off the hook because they're willing to bend? Mark didn't answer, David's voice tightened. Every time we back down, we tell them it's fine. We tell them the weight isn't as heavy as it feels. Mark sighed, though there was no fight left in his tone. I know you're right. I do. But I also know the cost. David opened his eyes, the lights of the city flickering below like distant stars. The cost was never mine to carry alone. David said, not this time. The next morning, David sat in the corner of the hotel lobby, sipping black coffee as the city stirred around him. His phone buzzed. Mr. Sinclair, our board has agreed to proceed with the audit. We will contact you with updates as it progresses. Additionally, our CEO would like to extend an invitation to discuss further initiatives aimed at addressing the issues you raised. Sincerely, Lisa Howard. David lowered the phone, his eyes fixed on the words. Not with satisfaction but with the calm understanding of a man who knew this was only the beginning. The audit wasn't the victory. The victory would come when no one else had to call someone like Mark Leland just to keep the seat they'd already paid for. David rose from his chair, adjusting his jacket with slow precision. As he stepped outside, the cool morning air brushed against his face, crisp and full of promise. The world had not changed overnight, but David knew that storms, even the quiet ones, have a way of reshaping the sky. David Sinclair never expected closure to come wrapped in ceremony. The skies don't keep records of apologies. Planes don't fly smoother because someone regrets what happened at 30,000 feet. But David wasn't chasing apologies. What he needed was something far more elusive. A shift, a crack in the armor of things left unsaid. And for the first time in a long while, he could feel it. It had been 2 weeks since the audit was announced. 2 weeks of headlines tucked into the business section, far enough back that most people would miss them unless they were looking. But David wasn't most people. He had lived long enough to know that real battles don't happen in front of cameras. They happen in rooms with closed doors, over coffee that's gone cold, and under the watchful eyes of men who smile in public but frown when the blinds are drawn. David was invited to one of those rooms now. The airline's headquarters sat like a monument to glass and steel, tall, gleaming, but hollow at the center. David recognized the architecture. Not because he'd been here before, but because he'd seen places like it his whole life. Buildings like this were mirrors, reflecting the men who built them and the shadows of those they left standing outside. David stepped through the revolving doors, feeling the weight of those shadows follow him. Lisa Howard greeted him in the lobby, her smile tight but genuine. Mr. Sinclair, she said, extending her hand. David shook it firmly. Thank you for coming, she added, leading him toward the elevator. As the doors closed behind them, the silence between them stretched thin. Lisa's reflection flickered in the polished steel, her eyes darting between the numbers as they climbed. I appreciate you agreeing to meet with us, she said softly, as if trying to fill the space. David nodded, though his expression didn't change. I'm not here for the meeting, Lisa, he replied. I'm here to see if you meant what you said. Lisa's eyes lowered, but she didn't respond. The doors opened on the 12th floor. Inside the conference room, the air felt heavier. Thomas Grady sat at the far end of the table. His chair turned slightly away from the door as if he hoped David might mistake him for part of the furniture. Mark Leland had warned David about Grady. He'll talk circles around you if you let him. Don't. David didn't plan to. Mr. Sinclair, Grady said, rising slowly. Good to see you again. David's eyes didn't waver. I wish I could say the same. Lisa's breath caught slightly, but she recovered, taking the seat beside David as the meeting began. Grady shuffled papers, clearing his throat as he dove into the script. David expected the same polished language about commitment to diversity, sensitivity training, and corporate responsibility. David let him speak, but with every word, the air in the room tightened, like a string being pulled inch by inch until the tension could no longer hold. Finally, David leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Mr. Grady, David interrupted, his voice calm but cold. Tell me something. Grady's mouth froze mid-sentence. Would you be having this meeting right now if I wasn't who I am? Grady blinked. If I didn't know Mark Leland, if I didn't have the money or the name, would you be sitting here talking about audits and initiatives? Grady's lips pressed into a thin line. Lisa shifted uncomfortably beside him, her gaze flicking toward Grady, waiting to see how he would respond. Grady inhaled slowly, measuring his words. I believe. No. David said, cutting him off sharply. Don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you know. Grady's eyes darkened, but David didn't flinch. I know this, David continued, his voice rising just slightly. Laura Delaney didn't move me from that seat because she misunderstood policy. She moved me because the world let her think it was okay. And the only reason you're trying to fix it now is because you didn't expect me to push back. The room went still. David could feel the weight of his words settling on their shoulders. Lisa's voice broke the silence. You're right, she said softly. You're absolutely right. David's gaze shifted toward her, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But Lisa's face was steady. We've relied on silence, she admitted, for a long time. I can't undo that overnight, Mr. Sinclair, but I can make sure this doesn't get buried. David leaned back, folding his arms. And how do you plan to do that? Lisa's eyes met his directly. Unwavering. By changing the system, she said, not just for you, but for the people who didn't have the chance to sit at this table. David studied her carefully. He had heard promises before. But something about the weight in her voice told him she understood. Or at the very least she was beginning to. As David stepped outside into the sunlight, the city felt different, not because the fight was over, but because he could feel the cracks forming beneath the surface, the kind that deepen over time, spreading until the weight becomes too much and the old structures begin to break. David Sinclair had spent his life learning to carry that weight. But today, for the first time, he felt something shift. He walked slowly down the street, his shadow stretching long behind him. And for once, it didn't feel heavy at all.